So over the last handful of years in the NBA, there's been a bit of a revolution in terms of how the game of basketball is viewed by spectators. There was a huge shift from going by the eye test, aka just watching the game and coming to your conclusions based off of that, to a process of evaluation that focuses much more on numbers and statistics, aka a more analytical perspective. This shift has caused an overgeneralization of NBA fans into two different categories: pro-analytics and anti-analytics, with the first group often being associated with nerdy-looking guys that never played in the league, and the second group being associated with the long line of former players that went into the media once they retired. But regardless of those stereotypes, that pro-analytics mindset continues to become more and more legitimate with each season. But the topic of today's video is one of the earliest popularized metrics of this movement, plus-minus, and why it's both overused by the general NBA community and essentially entirely useless as a whole. Okay, so what started this? What made me think that this was a video that needed to be made? Well, pretty often you'll see people on Twitter that are posting, either positively or negatively about a stat line of a player: points, rebounds, how many shots they made, percentages, all that stuff. And pretty often at the bottom of it, they'll say, minus 26 or plus 30 or whatever. And it's just such a throw-in thing that's supposed to say this guy was so much better when a team was on the floor. And I don't think it needs to be used at all. So first, let's talk about what exactly plus minus is. Well, it's supposed to measure the impact of a player on the floor on the scoreboard. So if you're on the floor and your team wins by 7 in the 4-minute stretch that you're on there, once you come off, your plus minus is plus 7. So then for the entire game, if you play 28 minutes and the team wins by 10 while you're on the floor, then you would have a plus 10 in plus minus. Now, how is that supposed to help? Well, ideally, it tells you which players are impacting the scoreboard positively or negatively, aka which teams are impacting winning in a positive or a negative way in their minutes on the floor. Which once again, ideally is supposed to boil down the impact of a player on winning a basketball game to a single number, which has been a movement and a pursuit that's been chased by so many people over the last 5 or so years, to boil down everything that a player does in a basketball court and say, this number tells you if they did it correctly or not, or if they played well or they didn't. And part of that is just so people don't have to watch the games as closely, but it's also just as a measurement tool against other players. So now that we've established what plus minus is and what it's supposed to do, what exactly is wrong with it? Why do I have this big issue with it? Well, first of all, it's a metric that is entirely without context. The only thing that it cares about is whether your team outscored the opponent in your minutes on the floor. It doesn't account for anything else. It doesn't account for how well you're actually playing. It doesn't account for the lineups that you're playing with or against, or shot making. So for example, there could be an end of the bench guy that gets thrown in there, like the 9th or 10th guy on the roster. He gets some minutes and he happens to be playing with 4 other starters playing against the other team's completely bench lineup. And if they play well in that stretch, he's going to have a pretty awesome plus minus. But it doesn't account for the fact that, the team should have been a lot better in those minutes on the floor because they have most of their starters out there while the other team has entirely bench guys. And that can just be so coincidental in terms of lineups and substitution patterns, because you can just happen to be on the floor in a good time and have a really good plus minus. Or on the other end, you could have a starter that's playing with 4 bench players against most of the other team's starters, and their plus minus doesn't look great because they're having to carry this group of not as talented players. So essentially, this metric should be relative to your expectations of the team on the floor at the time. So if you want to make it a little bit better and improve it, there are still plenty of issues with this, but essentially you should say, okay, if we've got this lineup on the floor against this other lineup for an 8-minute stretch, we expect that we're going to lose by 7 points in this stretch. Just based off everything that we have numbers wise, we think that we're 7 points worse than this team over 4 minutes or however long they're on the floor. But when they come off the floor, if you've only lost that stretch by 3 or by 4, then that's a positive thing. Just losing while that lineup's out there doesn't mean that they did a poor job, because it's relative to the expectations that you have for that group against the other lineup. And so essentially it turns what should be a positive thing in some scenarios into a negative thing, and vice versa as well. Again, just because there's absolutely no context to it specifically as it relates to lineups. And added on to that, this is an entirely result-based statistic. There's nothing about this that tells you anything happening in the game except for whether or not teams are scoring points against you and whether you're scoring points and putting points up on the scoreboard. And that's a big issue because there's a lot of other things that go into a possession in a basketball game other than just, whether the shot went in or it didn't. There's positioning, there's rhythm, there's flow, there's chemistry, there's continuity. There's so many other things you have to actually watch the game to see whether or not they're playing well, and you can't just say, oh, they won by 10 points when he was out there. He's playing really well for them. For example, just think about however many games you've watched in the NBA to this point this year. How many times do you watch and a team has a really good defensive possession? They're switching, they're communicating, they're closing out, they're rotating well, and the other team just makes a ridiculous shot at the end of the shot clock or really crazy, corner three at the very last second. How many times do you see that? Because these players are just so good in terms of shot making. Well, even though that possession was so good defensively, that group of players on the floor is going to have a negative in their plus minus for that possession because the shot just happened to go in, despite the fact that they did mostly everything correct. And then you can flip that to the offensive end as well. A lot of times you'll see, teams run a really good offensive set, or they get really good offense, and they just miss the shot. Like, they do everything right. They get in the paint, they kick it out, wide open corner three for JJ Redick or whoever it is, a really good three-point shooter, and they just miss the shot. And that doesn't positively impact their plus minus, even though they did a lot of really good things in that individual possession. So not only is this metric without context in terms of lineups, but it's also without context in terms of shot making. You could have a player on the floor that's doing a lot of good things, getting up and down the floor, playing great defense, moving the ball on offense, maybe not scoring, but they're doing a lot of other good things. But if their team is just not making shots when they're out there, their plus minus is not going to be very good at all, and it doesn't indicate any of the process that they went through to be really good on the floor. It only focuses on the results of whether or not points were scored for or against them. And I want to be clear at this point in the video that I'm specifically talking about just generic plus minus, not like box plus minus and all these other things. Just the regular roll, you get to the end of the game and it's always on like the ESPN game log thing and it says minus 20 or plus 20 or whatever it is. That is just, it's a wildly ineffective stat for what it's trying to do. Like, yes, it tells you the difference in the scoreboard when that player's on the floor, but it doesn't tell you literally anything else. And at the end of the day, there's just stats and metrics that do this better. Like, there are so many other ways to measure a player's impact on the floor that focus a little bit more on the process of what they're doing rather than just the result of whether or not the ball is going to the basket, because that's not what necessarily shows you how well a player is playing. Unless they're a really good shooter and they're just missing shots, like that's definitely like a really good indicator that they're not playing well. But just whether or not the ball goes in the basket on a given possession doesn't necessarily mean that that player is playing well or not. And so at the end of the day, as much as we might try, it's going to be incredibly difficult and borderline impossible to ever boil down a player's impact on the game and on winning or losing to one single number. It's not a feasible thing, as much as this analytics movement, and that's something I'm very for, by the way, and I think analytics is really good for the game. As much as that is going to try and push towards that goal, there's just no way that you can get to the end of the game and say, that's the best player, here's the number that shows it. You still have to watch the game, you have to incorporate all of these different metrics and to make your argument, say, that guy's the best player, this is a really underutilized player on another team, maybe we should bring them in. And there's front offices that are really good at that, but I highly doubt that many, if any of them, are using just regular plus minus as a really good metric to kind of evaluate other players around the league. And so for me, the case that I'm making here is just like PER to a certain extent, or per 36 stats in a lot of different circumstances. This measurement, this plus minus metric, just needs to go away. Like, we just need to accept that there are better ways to do exactly what it's trying to do, and that it's inherently flawed in multiple ways, whether it be context or shot making or lineups or whatever it is. It just doesn't need to be used. And honestly, like, it doesn't need to be in the ESPN box score. It doesn't really need to be in a basketball reference database. Like, show me something else that tells me what a player is actually doing correctly or not, other than just whether or not the ball is going in. That's my only case. Just stop using plus minus in your arguments and stop relying on it as a whole, as a basketball community, to say, this guy was really good on the floor. Like, one of the biggest culprits of this is people love to say bad things about Russell Westbrook because his plus minus is almost always really, really bad and really, really negative, because the Rockets are awful when James Harden is not on the floor. And to a certain extent, that's probably fair. Russell Westbrook's not having an outstanding season, but you also have to consider the other players that he's on the floor with. If Harden's not out there, he doesn't have a great supporting cast. He's playing against probably just when their rotations are, he's probably playing against some of the other team's starters as well when Harden comes off the floor. So just consider not using this stat anymore. Find some other stuff, because this is, in my opinion, probably one of the worst analytical metrics you could possibly use to measure a player's impact. And there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.